Hey Georgia, so I'm going to give you chapter 3 feedback in this video. I'm not going to give you all of it. Obviously, I've marked up the draft and I've scanned it, and that's what you'll want to use to make the changes. But I thought there were a few points where I should kind of talk you through it. Um, I I will say, so I have this feedback page. Um, as it seems like you want to do this, and Dr. Pope made the suggestion, and you both seem to kind of concur that maybe it's simpler to go back to just having females as your student participants. And so as I was reading this chapter, I was kind of reading with that thought of what it'll be like for you to revise to go back to girls. And I don't think it'll be too hard. And the reason is because you use a lot of gender neutral terms to describe your student participants. A lot of the time you call them participants. I think maybe sometimes you call them student participants when you're also contrasting it with the teacher participant. And then sometimes you just call them students. And I don't think you need to make a lot of changes. I don't think you need to go make the effort to say girls constantly. I think the way you've done it actually works, because if in your participant section you say my participants are blah blah blah, they're girls, among the students they're going to be female students, and then you say teacher, then you don't need to make a lot of changes. So that's a good thing about your chapter. There were a couple sections where I said that I kind of just skipped because they were so heavily involved with the multi case study that I didn't really bother reading them too heavily because I know that you're going to probably change them. I know that you and I have worked together for a year now, so you probably know what I mean when I put a little hump above and below a spot where I think that there's a spacing issue. Let me see if I can find one really quickly. I'm going to pause you and look for one really quickly. There's one right there where I put the little hump above and little hump below, and that's my way of saying that I think there might be too much space there. But I also learned when I was reading your chapter 2 in track changes that sometimes I would see, I'd even mark up a spot where I thought there was too much space, but then when you get to the actual draft, there's not too much space. So I don't know why it is that it appears to be too much space sometimes and there's not. I think it might have to do with, I think in some cases you've got your document, I can't remember what it's called right now, where you justify it like in a business style where it stretches it across, but I want you to make sure that you're left justifying your paper. I note that I scrawled that on top of one of your pages. Just I think you should make sure it's left justified. I believe that's correct formatting. But I wanted to make sure that you were aware of what my humps mean, because sometimes I don't say too much space. But when you see that, just check and make sure that there's not too much space there. That's it. On your headings, check your heading level 4. I think the APA manual, page 62, will show you. Heading level 4, which you do have in this section on page 62. Actually, I could have the heading level incorrect when I say heading level 4. Anyway, check your levels 3 and 4. I think you have a level 3 in this paper. You might even have an opportunity for level 4. Just make sure you know that those are sort of like sentence case, so they're only uppercase the first letter of the first word. And yeah, that's it. So we may come across some examples in a minute when I go through your paper and show you. Just check them. There's a little bit off with that. In your proposed data collection procedure section, there's a few changes I'm recommending, but one is that you open the section with interview protocol, but that doesn't really make sense from a top-down perspective. You really want to start with, at the highest level, the H3 level of this. So this title that you've got is correct. It's at an H2. That's great. And so all the types of data collection, which are your interviews, your observations, your survey, and I can't remember what the fourth one is right now because it is Friday night, almost 8 o'clock p.m. I'm sorry. But your 4 kinds of data collection, those are definitely H3 level. But then you talk about interview protocol, that's subordinate to your type of data collection of interview. So you should not start, the way you have it in this draft is you start with interview protocol, but really you need to talk to us more generally first about interviews as a data collection strategy that you're going to use, and then you can have your section on interview protocol. So then that therefore should be a more subordinate type of heading. Okay, so just you'll see in that section I make some recommendations. I'm going to actually go through and talk to you about it as well in a minute when we look at the chapter. Let's see, teacher interviews versus student. This is really almost a non-comment. I didn't really make this comment on the draft either, but when I was reading the interview section, I was thinking it might make sense in your organizing to treat the teacher interview versus the student more specifically, but I think it's okay the way you've done it. So let's just leave it alone for now. But if you do need a way to like more specifically organize those sections, that's one way to do it, because you do have two different kinds of interview. You have a teacher interview that has its purpose, and you have student interviews which have their purpose, and they're not exactly the same, and they're not the same audience. Let's see here, tables 1 and 2 and end of proposed data collection procedure section. So this section at the end, I think you've got some stuff at the end that should be moved a little bit. So I try to explain that, and maybe I'm going to try to explain it in this video in a minute. Also, you don't label table 1 or 2. One of them is mislabeled. I think it's table 1 that you refer to at least at some point as table 2. So I got confused, and so I made some markup that reflected that. So I'm going to try to talk about that too in a second. Just make sure you just double check how you name them, both in the text and then on the table itself. I think what I'm going to end up recommending is that the second table actually come first, that it be presented earlier in this proposed data collection procedure section, because it makes sense. It's sort of a high level alignment of your data collection, your research questions with your data collection methods. And so it makes sense to make it first. I think it should be table 1. And then table 2 is a little more detailed, and it's a little more specifically related to the interview protocol itself. So that's more detailed. I think that should come a little bit later when you're actually in the interview section. And you have it currently, that table 1, it's currently called table 1. It's in that interview section. It's in the right spot. But what I'm saying is, because I'm going to ask you to move that second table up earlier as part of your introduction to this whole section, then that flips the order of the tables. So that's all. Okay, so let's go in, and I may add some notes to this feedback as I go through the manuscript with the markup. I may have some things I want to add to this as well. Okay. I trust you know how my markup works, but I'm going to just read through this first one as a quick example. Here I'm suggesting with this little inserty thing that you insert the word are and you remove the word is. Here you insert a comma. Here you delete all of this, and you're connecting these sentences so it doesn't need to be uppercase. You're deleting that word, and then you're ending here with a period. So that's what that is. Then you delete all this extra stuff and you insert the word to. So I think you know how my marks work. I know sometimes it gets a little cramped and crowded and probably confusing. And then this little marking through, that means delete, but sometimes I'm afraid that, if you haven't worked in, anyway, I'm an English major, so I think we have our own conventions from those days of being an English major. And so this might be English professor kind of markup that I'm doing. So sometimes even though this means delete, I also say no comma. But really, if I just ever put this squiggly without any words, it's all it means. It means delete. Okay, so I do think you should cite in a couple spots, but sometimes I don't think you should cite because so like if you see big swaths where I'm not telling you to cite, it's because I actually think that those are your words, those are your statements, they're representing you, kind of pulling everything together, and so that's what that is about. I know I kind of addressed that already. Okay, I'm going to pause and now check for the most important things that I need to talk to you about before I run out of time on this video. Okay, so I've scrolled to page 65 and I wrote skipped because for the most part, I think that this is stuff that you're going to update with your updated methodology. And I know you've been working on that a little bit. So I've kind of skipped that. I did read this section. however, and I'm not really messing with this figure because I know it's related to the multi-case study. So it may be that this just goes away altogether. I did like this figure. I thought it was pretty cool. All right, so I'm going to pause again. We're getting to something I want to talk about related to timeline. So I'm proposing that you do add after context that here where you start with the timeline for completing, that you actually create a new section on timeline. And then later in your paper, you've got some timeline related stuff. So I'm going to suggest you put that into this timeline section. This sentence at the top, bottom of 68, top of 69, I thought it had an awkward opening. So I just took all of that important information and put it at the end as well. So hopefully that makes sense, what I'm suggesting there. Okay, on page 71, this is where you start the section with interview protocol, but as I had suggested in the written notes, I recommend that you start this section with interviews. So you take all this interview protocol stuff and you just kind of hold off on it. It doesn't get its turn yet. But actually, before we even get to that, I would propose that you have some intro verbiage related to your data collection procedures. And where you're going to find this is at the end of this section, specifically page 78. We're going to go down there really quickly. 78. Okay. First, let me deal with this because I talked about timeline a minute ago. I do think this yellow stuff could go well in that timeline section. I mean, you can leave it here, but it's better organized, I think, if you just put it in timeline. Okay? A suggestion. And then I got confused. I marked this out because you said table 2 provides a reference. Well, if you look above, you actually say table 2. You mentioned table 2 already in the body, but it was because I was confused about how you were labeling the tables. So I did mark it out, but you may end up wanting to include this statement wherever you're going to make reference to the tables. But we've got this green stuff, the various data collection methods of interviews, observations. We'll see how that's big picture. That doesn't belong in this section on audio recording. This is big picture, and I think that it might actually, and that's why video means I'm talking about it on the video. I think it actually goes better if you put it as the opener for the proposed data collection procedures section. Okay, and also be sure that you uppercase your theories, that you're consistent with how you write those theories, because they're not lowercase, I don't think, from your chapter 2. Okay, so let's go back and look then where I'm talking about this should go. This sort of general stuff that I had in green. I think that it should go right after, so right here, before we get to the H3s. It should just go here. Okay, and then if it goes there, then I think that table 2 should be, that's where you should cite table 2. So you probably just keep that passage that I had struck out about table 2 providing a reference to the various data collection sources. Just put it there, and then table 2 needs to follow fairly immediately. Then the section needs to proceed with interviews, and then you drill down further into interview protocol, and that's where you mention this other table. Notice how you're calling this table 2 here on page 72, and then it's depicted on 73, but then you call it table 1. See how I was a little bit confused about what table was what, and I thought you were being redundant about what you were calling things. But this table makes sense as a follow-up to the other table where you're aligning the types of the research questions with the types of data source. And on this table, watch how you be really anal about how you make case things. Just be consistent in lower uppercase titling of things. And then this yellow stuff, these aren't social role theory, right? These are self-determination theory. So double check that and label it appropriately. I liked this yellow sentence. However, if you read, it doesn't really seem to flow very well. It's sort of jarring. And then I just want to make sure, when you do web conferencing, are you planning to use video? Some students aren't going to be able to use video, maybe. I don't know. And so I'm not sure you're going to be able to see them. So just something to think about. I can see that I am going to run out of time, so I'm going to have to go into a second video.